seems to me we need a ghost. And this story comes from Scotland. A long time ago, there was a small village. And outside the village, there was a place where two roads came together in a cross, and the land between them was high and level. And it was known as the dancing place, because on many a summer's evening, the young people of the village would gather there and dance the night away. They didn't have any music, just the sound of their own singing and humming, but they spent many happy hours there. And one night, they were all out there dancing, all except one young woman. She sat all by herself off to the side next to a fence. She sat there and she watched the dancers, and she wept and she wailed, for her true love was dead. He'd been a fisherman, and he had drowned in the herring fishing that spring. And ever since that terrible day, she had vowed she would not smile or laugh or sing or dance ever again. She spent her days weeping. Even at night, the tears ran down her cheeks as she slept. And it was the grief of her life. She could not sit by his grave, for his body had been found on the shore of a village far from hers. They had buried her in that far-off village, and so she sat by that fence and she wept. And as time passed, the dancers began to hear hoofbeats coming down the road, closer and closer. A large black horse, and on it a tall, dark stranger, all dressed in black. He rode up, jumped off his horse, and strode in his tall, shiny black boots into the midst of the dancers, kicked up his heels, and danced with the best of them. But it grew late, and the people began to leave, one and two at a time, until finally the only two people left at the dancing place were the tall, dark stranger and the woman who wept by the fence. He walked over to her, looked down, and said, "I can see that you were beautiful once. You'll be beautiful again if you just come and dance with me." And he put out his hand to her. She looked up at him, and her eyes were so blinded with tears, she could not see his face. She said, "Why should I not weep? My true love is dead." He said, "Don't you know? Your weeping and wailing keeps the dead restless in their graves. Now come, dance with me." And he took her by the hand so strongly she could not resist. He pulled her up to the dancing place and began to turn her around in the dance. She found her feet did remember the steps, and they turned faster and faster and faster, round and round and round, until suddenly he stopped, and a shaft of moonlight hit his face. She looked up and she gasped, for it was not the face of a stranger. It was the face of her own true love, and her heart leaped with joy. She said, "You've come back to me. They told me you were dead." He said, "Is that what they told you?" She said, "They told me you were buried in a village far from here and that I would never see you again." He said, "Is that what they told you?" She said, "Oh, take me with you. We'll never be separated again." He said, "Oh, you would not like where I stay now. It is cold and dark, and the walls are high and damp. You would do better to find yourself a new love." She said, "No, I'll work hard. We'll make us a better life." And when he saw he could not dissuade her, he led her over to his horse. He jumped on the horse's back and pulled her up behind him. He said, "Hold on tight. We have a long way to go." She wrapped her arms around his waist, and they began to ride through the night over the roads. At one point, the wind whipped out one end of her shawl. She reached out, she grabbed that shawl, she tied it firmly about her, and then she put her arms around his waist again. But what was this? "Your clothes," she said. They're soaking wet. We have not ridden through rain." He did not answer, just kept riding on and on through the night, hour after hour, until finally they came to a distant village. He rode into the village until they came to a church, and next to the church was a graveyard. And he drew the horse to a stop. He jumped off. He pulled her off. He held her arms in his hands, and he said, "Your weeping and wailing has kept me awake night and day, and if my clothes are wet, it's no wonder, for your tears have soaked them through. But now I shall have peace at last, for you shall lie beside me in my grave." And she looked up and saw not the face of her true love, but the bony skull of a skeleton. And the fingers holding her arms were the bony fingers of a skeleton's hands. And she knew at last her love was dead. And she screamed and she jerked so quickly he lost his grip. She began to run down the road as fast as she could, running for her life. The skeleton ran after her, his long, bony fingers reaching out behind her. He grabbed her shawl. She threw off her shawl and kept on running. And at that moment, the first rays of the sun came over the horizon, and the skeleton vanished, and his horse with him. And she knew she was safe. She was so overcome, she fainted right there in the road. And she lay there until some milkmaids coming by found her. They took her to a nearby house. Everyone wanted to hear her story, but when she told it, no one believed her. Until later that day, when the church caretaker was cleaning the graves in the graveyard, and he came upon one and found a bit of cloth coming up from the dirt. They brought the girl around. She said, "Yes, that's my shawl." So they dug up the dirt and found the other end of the shawl caught tight in the coffin buried there. They got permission to open the coffin, and when they did, they found the other end of the shawl clutched tight in the fingers of the skeleton buried there. It was the grave of her lost love. The young woman took her shawl and she went home. But from that day, she never wept or wailed for her lost love. She knew that if she did, he would come back to fetch her again.